The rust-colored dust settled on Maggie Coleman's boots as she stood before the massive John Deere 4020, a mechanical dinosaur that had died decades ago in this forgotten corner of her uncle's property. The tractor's once vibrant green paint had surrendered to a patchwork of oxidation, like autumn had permanently stained its metal bones. She ran her fingers along the cracked leather seat, feeling 30 years of Nebraska summers baked into its surface. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This is it? Maggie asked the executor, unable to mask the disappointment in her voice. After everything, Uncle Henry left me, a broken tractor? The lawyer, a man whose name she'd already forgotten, shifted uncomfortably, manila folder clutched to his chest like armor. The will was specific, Ms. Coleman. The John Deere and whatever it contains goes to you. The farmland goes to your cousin Robert. The unfairness of it burned in her throat. 300 acres of prime farmland to her cousin who hadn't visited in 15 years, and she got a rusted heap of metal that wouldn't fetch $500 at auction. Behind her, 10-year-old Dylan kicked at the hard-packed earth, his thin shoulders hunched against the wind that swept across the empty fields. "Mom, can we just go?" he asked, voice small against the vastness of the prairie. "This place smells like dead stuff." Maggie swallowed her bitterness. "Soon, honey. I just need to sign some papers." 6 months ago, she'd been managing client portfolios at an investment firm in Chicago. Now she was unemployed, divorced, and standing in a field in western Nebraska, inheriting farm equipment that had been obsolete before her son was born. The economic collapse had taken her job, her marriage had taken her confidence, and now fate seemed determined to take her dignity as well. The executor cleared his throat. "There's one more thing, Ms. Coleman. Your uncle left this for you." He handed her a small brass key, tarnished with age. "He said you'd know what to do with it when the time came." "I haven't seen Uncle Henry since I was 12, Maggie said, examining the key. "I have no idea what this opens." "Perhaps something on the tractor," the man suggested, clearly eager to finish this business and return to civilization. The terms of the will stated you needed to be physically present to claim your inheritance, and that the key must be handed over in person. Maggie pocketed the key, her mind racing. Henry Coleman had been the black sheep of the family, her father's eccentric older brother who had chosen to remain on the family farm while everyone else scattered to cities across the country. She remembered him as a quiet man with calloused hands and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. "I'll need to arrange for someone to haul this away," she said, gesturing toward the tractor. "That won't be necessary," came a deep voice from behind her. Maggie turned to find a man in his 40s walking toward them, dust clinging to his worn jeans and flannel shirt. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lines etched around eyes that assessed her with undisguised curiosity. "Nathan Whitaker," he said, extending a hand. "I farm the adjacent property. Henry mentioned you might be coming by someday. Did he mention he was leaving me a piece of junk instead of something valuable?" The bitterness slipped out before she could stop it. Nathan's expression didn't change. "Henry never did anything without reason, Ms. Coleman." "Maggie," she corrected automatically. "I can store the tractor in my barn until you decide what to do with it," he offered. "No charge." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dylan had wandered over to the tractor and climbed onto the massive rear wheel, balancing with the natural confidence of childhood. "Mom, look at me. I'm like 10 feet tall." "Be careful," she called, maternal anxiety flaring. "That thing's been sitting here for ages." "Oh, not quite that long," Nathan said quietly. "Henry was still using this tractor about 5 years ago, before his health started failing." Maggie frowned. "Using it? It looks like it's been abandoned since the Reagan administration. Appearances can be deceiving around here. The elements are harsh on the exterior, but the bones of things tend to last." His eyes met hers with an intensity that suggested he wasn't just talking about farm equipment. The executor shuffled his papers impatiently. If you'll just sign here, Ms. Coleman, I can be on my way. Maggie scrawled her signature across the indicated lines, officially accepting ownership of a tractor that would cost more to repair than it was worth. Perfect, she thought. Another burden to carry. As the lawyer's sedan disappeared down the dusty road, Nathan nodded toward the tractor. Want me to see if it'll start? Sometimes these old machines just need the right touch. Knock yourself out, Maggie said, watching as Dylan continued to explore the tractor, now examining the massive engine compartment with the fascination only a 10-year-old boy could muster for heavy machinery. Nathan climbed onto the tractor with practiced ease, his movements suggesting familiarity with the machine. He turned the key that had been left in the ignition, pumped something near the floorboard, and then pressed the starter button. The engine coughed, protested, and then to Maggie's astonishment, roared to life, belching a cloud of black smoke before settling into a steady rumble. No way, Maggie whispered. Henry always took care of what mattered, Nathan said, raising his voice above the engine noise. This is a collector's item now. Fully restored John Deere 4020s can sell for $25,000 or more. Dylan's eyes widened. $25,000? Mom, that's like $1 million kid dollars. Despite everything, Maggie laughed. Then she remembered the key in her pocket. Wait, my uncle left me a key. Maybe it's for something on the tractor? Nathan cut the engine, and in the sudden silence, the prairie wind seemed louder than before. There's a toolbox mounted behind the seat. Might be for that. Maggie climbed up, feeling the solid metal beneath her feet. It had been years since she'd been on a tractor, not since childhood visits to this very farm, when Uncle Henry would let her ride alongside him during the harvest, her small body bouncing on the edge of the seat as they cut through fields of wheat. The toolbox was secured with a padlock, ancient and rust-flecked. She slipped the brass key into it, and to her surprise, it turned smoothly. The hasp released with a metallic click. Inside was not the expected assortment of wrenches and tools, but a leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked with age, and a sealed envelope with her name written in a shaky hand. What is it? Dylan asked, trying to peer into the box. I'm not sure, Maggie replied, lifting out the ledger. It was heavier than she expected, its pages thick and warped slightly, as if it had absorbed decades of humidity and diesel fumes. She opened the envelope first, breaking the seal with trembling fingers. The letter inside was written in her uncle's distinctive handwriting, the letters slanting sharply to the right as if leaning into a strong wind. Dear Maggie, she read aloud, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found your way back to where you belong, even if you don't know it yet. She paused, something catching in her throat. I've watched from a distance as you've built your life in the city, climbing ladders that only lead to smaller boxes. I know about the divorce, the job loss. Word travels, even to old farmers like me. Maggie looked up, eyes narrowing at Nathan. He knew about my divorce? How? Nathan shrugged, but something in his expression suggested he knew more than he was saying. She continued reading, what I leave you may seem worthless at first glance, much like this farm appeared to your father when he left for Chicago 40 years ago. But there are treasures hidden in plain sight for those patient enough to look beneath rust and dust. The ledger contains the location and details of every piece I ever buried. Yes, buried. When I returned from Vietnam in '72, I didn't trust banks or governments or even walls and lockboxes. So I put my faith in the land itself. Maggie's hands began to shake as she opened the ledger. The first page showed a hand-drawn map of the farm, with X marks scattered across the property. Each subsequent page contained meticulous notes, dates, descriptions, precise locations measured in steps from fixed landmarks, and depths. April 17, 1974, 3 Morgan silver dollars, 1 gold sovereign, British, 1910, NW corner of North Field, 37 steps from lightning-struck oak, depth 4 feet. June 22, 1981, silver bars, 10 ounces each, 5 count, east edge of pond, 22 steps from large boulder, depth 5 feet. The entries continued, page after page, spanning nearly 50 years. Coins, jewelry, small artifacts, all carefully documented and buried across the property. Property that now belonged to her cousin Robert. "My God," she whispered. Nathan leaned against the tractor wheel, arms crossed. "Henry always said traditional banking was for people who didn't understand value. Did you know about this?" Maggie demanded, waving the ledger. "I knew Henry had unconventional storage methods," he replied carefully. "But the extent of it? No." The final page of the ledger contained a note in fresher ink, likely added in recent years. "The tractor holds the key, both literally and figuratively. The engine compartment contains a false bottom. What you find there is legally yours, documented with the county clerk as a separate asset from the land. The rest is a map to what could be yours, if you're half as stubborn as I remember." Dylan, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly piped up. "Mom, there's something weird about this part here." He was pointing to a section of the engine compartment, where the metal seemed slightly different in color and texture. Nathan stepped forward. "Let me help with that." He reached into the compartment, fingers finding an almost invisible seam. With practiced movements, he released a hidden catch and lifted a metal panel, revealing a cavity beneath. Inside was a metal lockbox. Maggie's hands trembled as she inserted the brass key into the second lock. It turned with a solid click, and the lid sprang open. Nestled inside on a bed of faded velvet was an assortment of coins, gleaming gold and silver that had been protected from the elements. Atop them lay a small leather pouch and another envelope. "Holy treasure, Mom!" Dylan exclaimed, eyes wide. Maggie opened the pouch first, gasping as a strand of pearls spilled into her palm, followed by a diamond ring that caught the afternoon sunlight and fractured it into rainbow shards. "That was your grandmother's wedding set," Nathan said quietly. "Henry kept it when she passed. Said it should stay in the family." The second envelope contained a formal-looking document and a brief note. "The coins and jewelry are appraised at $72,000. Not a fortune, but enough to start over. The true value is in what they represent, history that shouldn't be forgotten. There's more, Maggie, if you're willing to fight for what's yours." The document was a deed of ownership for the tractor, and an easement that granted the tractor's owner access to the entire property for agricultural and historical research purposes. It had been filed with the county 15 years ago, long before anyone knew Robert would inherit the land. "He knew," Maggie whispered. "Somehow, he knew I'd need this." Nathan nodded. "Henry played the long game. Always did." "But why?" she asked, gesturing at the farm around them. "Why not just leave me the land?" "The land goes to blood," Nathan said simply. "Family tradition. Oldest male heir. Henry couldn't change that without breaking faith with generations before him. But he found a way around it." A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Like I said, Henry never did anything without reason." Dylan had climbed back onto the tractor's seat and was pretending to drive, making engine noises that competed with the real sound of the wind across the prairie. In that moment, he looked startlingly like the photographs Maggie had seen of her father as a boy, sitting on this very same tractor. "So what now?" she asked, more to herself than to Nathan. "Now you have a choice," he replied. "You can take the coins and jewelry, sell the tractor to a collector, and head back to Chicago with enough money to start fresh." He paused, looking out across the fields that stretched to the horizon. "Or you can stay and see what else Henry left for you to find." Maggie looked down at the ledger in her hands, then at Dylan, who seemed more animated than she'd seen him in months. Since the divorce, he'd retreated into video games and sullen silence, but here, in just an hour, he'd come alive in a way that made her heart ache. "We have nowhere to stay," she said, the practical part of her mind racing ahead. "And Robert hasn't set foot on this land in 15 years, Nathan cut in. And he's not likely to start now. He's too busy with his dental practice in Omaha." He hesitated, then added, "I have a guest house. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and comfortable. You could use it while you consider your options." The wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of earth and growing things. In the distance, storm clouds gathered, promising rain by nightfall. The farm would drink it in, the soil darkening, life stirring beneath the surface. What would you do? Maggie asked, meeting Nathan's steady gaze. I'd want to know what was buried, he said simply. Not just the valuables, but the history. Henry Coleman was the last of a dying breed, a man who understood that some things are worth more than their market value. Dylan jumped down from the tractor. Mom, can we stay? Please? I want to be a treasure hunter. Maggie looked at the ledger again, at the careful maps and notations spanning decades. Each entry represented a story, a piece of history her uncle had deemed worth preserving. And he had chosen her, not Robert, to be the keeper of those stories. I suppose we could stay a few days, she said finally. Just to see what's here. As if in response, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the prairie. The storm was coming, but for the first time in months, Maggie wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Nathan smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. I'll help you get the tractor back to my place before the rain hits. As he climbed up to start the engine, Maggie caught sight of something she hadn't noticed before, a small metal plate affixed to the side of the engine compartment, the words nearly obscured by rust and grime. She wiped it clean with her thumb, revealing an inscription, "The land remembers what men forget." That night, as rain lashed against the windows of Nathan's guest house, Maggie sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open before her and the contents of the lockbox arranged in neat piles. Dylan had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the day's excitement and the sudden shift from city rhythms to rural quiet. She traced her finger over a map entry from 1977, noting the careful measurements and descriptions. According to the ledger, less than half a mile from where she now sat, 3 feet beneath the soil, lay a collection of Civil War-era coins that her uncle had purchased from a collector in Kansas City. The tractor that had seemed like a cruel joke this morning now represented possibility, a key to unlocking whatever her uncle had buried across the 300 acres. Acres that legally belonged to Robert, but which she had the right to access. Robert would fight her, of course, once he realized what was at stake. The easement might grant her access, but it wouldn't stop him from bringing lawyers and challenging the validity of Henry's arrangements. Outside, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the barn where the John Deere now rested. For a moment, in that electric blue light, the rusted tractor looked almost new again, its potential restored by the darkness and the storm. Maggie closed the ledger and went to the window, watching the rain stream down the glass. Tomorrow, she would begin to dig, not just for buried treasure, but for answers about the uncle she'd barely known and the legacy he'd chosen her to protect. What she couldn't possibly know, as she finally turned away from the storm-lashed window, was that the contents of the lockbox were just the beginning. The true value of what Henry Coleman had hidden across his land would soon draw attention far beyond their small corner of Nebraska, attention from historians, museums, and people who would go to any length to possess what lay beneath the prairie soil. The morning after the storm, Maggie woke to the sound of a tractor engine. She pushed aside the faded gingham curtains to see Nathan already at work, the John Deere cutting a precise line across the field behind his house. Dawn painted everything in hues of amber and gold, transforming the weathered machine into something almost majestic against the Nebraska sky. Dylan appeared beside her, hair tousled from sleep. "Is Mr. Nathan digging for treasure already?" "No, honey. He's just farming." The word felt foreign on her tongue, disconnected from her life of spreadsheets and client portfolios. Yet watching Nathan work the land stirred something familiar, like a half-remembered dream. By the time they dressed and made their way outside, Nathan had returned to the barn. He greeted them with thermoses of coffee and hot chocolate, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thought we might head out to the Coleman place after breakfast," he said. "Start with something small from the ledger. Get a feel for Henry's system." Maggie hesitated. "I should probably call Robert first. Let him know what's happening." "Your call," Nathan replied, expression neutral. "But once lawyers get involved, everything gets complicated." He was right, of course. Robert would immediately see dollar signs, would try to claim ownership of whatever they found. The easement granted her access for research, but legal battles could drag on for years. Let's start with something modest, she decided. A test run. They chose an entry from 1979, a collection of silver dollars buried near the creek that marked the property's eastern boundary. According to Henry's notes, he'd placed them beneath a lightning-split oak, 4 feet down. The tree was exactly where the ledger indicated, its massive trunk scarred by an ancient strike that had cleaved it nearly in half without killing it. Nature's resilience manifested in wood and bark. Nathan brought shovels and a metal detector, approaching the task with methodical precision. Henry was exact in his measurements. Always was, even as a young man. You knew him well? Maggie asked, watching as Dylan carefully paced out the distances noted in the ledger. Knew him my whole life. He was the closest thing to a father I had after mine died. Nathan's voice carried a weight of history Maggie couldn't decipher. The metal detector shrieked when Dylan passed it over a spot precisely 17 steps from the oak. Nathan marked the location with a small flag, then handed Dylan a shovel sized for a child. First honors go to the youngest, he said with a solemnity that made the boy stand taller. They took turns digging, the physical labor unfamiliar to Maggie's office-conditioned body. Each shovelful revealed darker soil, damper from its proximity to the creek. At 3 feet, Nathan's shovel struck something solid. Dylan's eyes widened. Is that it? Let's see. Nathan knelt, using his hands to carefully brush away soil from a metal container about the size of a lunchbox. The container was sealed with wax around its edges, waterproofing that had kept the contents pristine despite decades underground. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay 20 silver dollars in protective sleeves, each labeled with its year and mint. The Morgan dollar collection, Maggie breathed, recognizing the distinctive profile of Liberty from her uncle's numismatic books. He showed me these when I was little. Said they were worth more than their weight because of their history. Dylan held one reverently. How much are they worth? Depends on condition and rarity, Nathan replied. But this set? Probably 8 to 10,000. The discovery lit a fire in Dylan that Maggie hadn't seen since before the divorce. All morning, he peppered Nathan with questions about coins, metal detecting, and what else might be buried across the farm. For the first time in months, her son seemed fully present, engaged with the world around him rather than retreating into screens and silence. By mid-afternoon, they had recovered 2 more caches, a small collection of gold sovereigns from the early 1900s and a set of Civil War tokens that Henry's notes indicated he'd purchased at auction in 1983. Each discovery followed the same pattern: precise location, careful burial, meticulous preservation. He wasn't just hiding valuables, Maggie realized, examining a token commemorating Lincoln's 1864 election. He was preserving history. Nathan nodded. Henry always said we're just temporary caretakers of both the land and the past. Our job is to make sure neither one gets destroyed on our watch. As the sun began its westward descent, they loaded their finds into Nathan's truck. The combined value of the day's discoveries approached $20,000, not a fortune, but more than Maggie had in her savings account after the divorce and job loss. We should stop at the bank, she suggested. Put these somewhere secure. There's a safe at my place, Nathan offered. Henry used it sometimes. Combinations in that second letter he left you. The casual revelation sparked Maggie's suspicion. How do you know what was in that letter? Nathan's expression remained steady. Because I drove him to the lawyer's office to finalize his will. He trusted me to make sure you found what he left. The implication hung between them as they drove back toward Nathan's farm. Henry hadn't left the tractor and its secrets to chance, he'd enlisted help to ensure his plan unfolded as intended. They crested a small rise, and Nathan suddenly slowed the truck. Looks like we've got company. A sleek black SUV was parked in front of his house, its city shine conspicuous against the weathered farm buildings. Beside it stood a man in an expensive suit, scrolling through his phone with impatient flicks of his manicured finger. Robert, Maggie whispered, her stomach clenching. Dylan pressed closer to her side. Is that my uncle? Technically. Though you've only met him once, at your grandfather's funeral. Robert Coleman looked up as they approached, his smile practiced and hollow. At 45, he bore little resemblance to the Coleman side of the family, his features taking after his mother's refined, almost aristocratic lineage. His dental practice in Omaha catered to the wealthy, and everything about him telegraphed careful cultivation of status. "Maggie," he called, voice carrying false warmth. "What a surprise to find you still here. I thought you'd be headed back to Chicago by now." Nathan parked and they climbed out, the tension immediate and palpable. Dylan hung back, instinctively wary. "Just taking care of some things Uncle Henry left me," Maggie replied, fighting to keep her voice neutral. Robert's gaze flicked to the tractor visible in Nathan's barn, then back to her face. "Yes, I heard about the unusual bequest. A broken-down tractor. Henry always did have a peculiar sense of humor." "It runs just fine," Dylan piped up, loyalty overcoming his shyness. Robert barely glanced at the boy. "I'm sure it does. Nathan here has always been good with farm equipment." The pause carried a dismissiveness that made Maggie's jaw tighten. "What brings you all the way from Omaha, Robert?" she asked. "I can't imagine you drove 3 hours just to check on me." "Professional courtesy. I heard you might be planning some activities on my property." "Something about an easement?" His smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. "My lawyer tells me it's quite specific, agricultural research only. Not treasure hunting." The last 2 words confirmed Maggie's worst fear: someone had talked. Word had spread about their activities today. Nathan stepped forward slightly. "The easement is legally binding, Robert. Filed with the county 15 years ago. Easements can be challenged, especially when they're being used for purposes outside their stated intent." Robert straightened his tie, a gesture that emphasized the gulf between his tailored suit and Nathan's worn flannel. "Besides, anything found on my property belongs to me, regardless of who digs it up." "That's not what the law says," Maggie countered, grateful for the hours she'd spent researching property rights on her phone the previous night. "Buried items remain the property of whoever placed them there, or their legal heirs, unless explicitly abandoned." Robert's smile thinned. "You've been doing your homework. But you're forgetting something important: proving intent. How will you establish that Henry meant for these items to be recovered rather than permanently abandoned?" "The ledger," Dylan said suddenly, then shrank back when all 3 adults turned to look at him. "What ledger?" Robert asked, his casual tone belied by the intensity of his gaze. Maggie silently cursed her son's helpful nature. "Nothing important. Just some of Uncle Henry's old farm records." Robert studied her face, clearly unconvinced. "I think we should discuss this further. Perhaps over dinner? I'm staying at the Ridgeline Inn tonight." "We have plans," Nathan interjected, his voice carrying a firmness that brooked no argument. Something shifted in Robert's expression, recognition of an old rivalry, perhaps, or calculation of new battle lines. "Another time, then. But Maggie, you should know, I've filed papers with the county requiring notification before any excavation takes place on my property. Standard procedure to protect against agricultural mishaps." The threat was clear. Their window of unrestricted access had just slammed shut. After Robert departed in his gleaming SUV, Nathan's normally stoic expression had hardened into something Maggie couldn't quite read. "He'll have people watching the property by morning," Nathan said, leading them inside. "How did he even know what we were doing?" Maggie demanded. "We only started today." Nathan's mouth set in a grim line. "Small towns have long memories and loose lips. My guess is someone at the diner heard us talking, or saw us with shovels headed toward Coleman land." Dylan clutched his backpack, which contained the coin sleeve he'd been allowed to carry. "Is he going to take our treasure?" "Not if I can help it," Maggie assured him, though uncertainty gnawed at her confidence. That evening, after Dylan had fallen asleep, Maggie spread the ledger across Nathan's kitchen table. The entries documented nearly 50 years of careful collecting and concealment: coins, historical documents, artifacts from multiple eras, all buried across the 300 acres that now legally belonged to Robert. "There's a fortune here," she said quietly. Not just in monetary value, but in historical significance. Nathan nodded, pouring coffee into chipped mugs that looked as weathered as his hands. Henry was building a time capsule, piece by piece. Said he didn't trust museums to tell the whole story, or banks to protect what mattered. But why not tell me? Why wait until after he died? Would you have believed him? Nathan's question hung in the air between them. The successful Chicago investment manager, being told her eccentric uncle had buried treasures across his farm like some paranoid doomsday prepper? He had a point. 6 months ago, she would have dismissed Henry's actions as the eccentricity of an isolated old man. Now, examining the ledger's meticulous records, she recognized the method behind what others might see as madness. There are over 200 locations documented here, she said, flipping through the pages. Some of these items could be historically significant enough for museums. That was the idea, Nathan replied. Henry wanted to preserve pieces of history that were being forgotten or misrepresented. Said someday, when the right person came along, they could bring it all back to light. And he thought I was the right person. I know nothing about historical artifacts or rural preservation or, you're a Coleman, Nathan cut in. That's all that mattered to him. Blood running true, even after generations in the city. Something in his tone made Maggie look up sharply. You don't approve. Nathan sighed, the sound carrying the weariness of long-held frustration. It's not about approval. It's about understanding what Henry was trying to do. This wasn't just about hiding valuable items. It was about keeping history safe until someone who cared enough could protect it properly. And you don't think that's me? I think you haven't decided yet if you're staying or going. His eyes met hers, direct and challenging. Henry believed you'd choose the land once you understood what was at stake. I'm not convinced. The accusation stung, partly because it contained truth. She hadn't decided if this unexpected inheritance was a temporary adventure or a life-altering opportunity. The practical part of her mind, the part shaped by corporate metrics and urban pragmatism, saw the buried items as assets to be liquidated, a financial cushion for rebuilding her life in Chicago. But another part, one that had awakened upon reading Henry's letter, sensed a deeper purpose in what her uncle had created, a legacy that transcended monetary value, a trust passed specifically to her for reasons she was only beginning to understand. Robert won't stop at legal maneuvers, Nathan said, breaking the silence. If he believes there's significant value buried on that land, he'll do whatever it takes to claim it. What do you suggest? Nathan's expression softened slightly. There's an entry from 1996. Page 47. Look at it. Maggie turned to the indicated page, finding a detailed diagram of what appeared to be an underground chamber rather than a simple burial site. According to Henry's notes, he'd constructed a concrete vault beneath the old smokehouse, accessible through a trapdoor concealed under decades of accumulated farm equipment. A vault? All this time? Nathan nodded. Large enough to store the most valuable pieces in his collection. The items we found today were just the beginning, tests he scattered across the property. The real collection is in that vault. How do you know this? Suspicion crept into Maggie's voice. Because I helped him build it. Nathan's admission came without apology or qualification. Summer of '96. I was just back from the Gulf War, working odd jobs around the county. Henry hired me to help with a special project. Took us nearly a month, working nights so nobody would notice. The revelation shifted something fundamental in Maggie's understanding of her uncle's plan, and Nathan's role in it. Henry hadn't just left cryptic clues, he'd established a network of confidence to ensure his vision survived his death. What's in the vault? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Items that could change how people understand this region's history. Native American artifacts he purchased from private collectors to keep them from being separated and sold piecemeal. Civil War documents that contradict the official narratives taught in schools. Things powerful people might prefer stayed buried, literally and figuratively. Maggie's mind raced with implications. And he trusted me with this responsibility? A woman who hasn't set foot on this farm in 20 years? He believed the Coleman blood would call you home eventually. Nathan's voice carried a strange mix of skepticism and hope. Said some things skip generations but never disappear. Before Maggie could respond, headlights swept across the kitchen window. A vehicle was coming up the long drive, moving too fast for a casual visitor. Nathan was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the alertness of someone accustomed to threats. County Sheriff's car. And Robert's SUV behind it. What do they want at this hour? Maggie checked her watch, nearly midnight. Nothing good. Nathan's expression darkened. Wake Dylan. Use the back door. Take my truck, keys are hanging by the mudroom. What? Why would we? Robert's not here for a friendly chat, Maggie. Not with the sheriff in tow at midnight. His voice carried an urgency that cut through her confusion. He's here to search for the ledger, maybe claim we stole artifacts from his property. If he finds it before we reach the vault, everything Henry worked for is lost. The implications crystallized with startling clarity. Robert wasn't just asserting legal ownership, he was moving to seize physical control of Henry's legacy before Maggie could fully understand what she'd inherited. Where should we go? She asked, already moving toward Dylan's room. The vault. It's the only place Robert doesn't know about yet. Nathan grabbed the ledger, rolling it tightly. There's an old service road that runs behind the north field. It'll take you to within a quarter mile of the smokehouse. I'll stall them here. Minutes later, Maggie was guiding Nathan's truck down a rutted dirt track, headlights off, navigating by moonlight and memory. Beside her, Dylan clutched his backpack, wide-eyed but silent, sensing the gravity of their midnight flight. Why is Uncle Robert bringing the police? He finally asked, voice small against the engine's rumble. It's complicated, honey. Maggie gripped the steering wheel tighter. Sometimes when valuable things are involved, people don't behave their best. Is Mr. Nathan going to be okay? The question pierced Maggie's determined focus. Nathan had placed himself between them and whatever legal maneuvering Robert had orchestrated, with no guarantee he could withstand the pressure. He's very capable, she said, hoping it was true. The service road ended at a barbed wire fence, beyond which lay the northern section of the Coleman property. Maggie parked behind a stand of trees, using branches to partially conceal the truck from casual observation. The walk to the smokehouse took 20 minutes, every step heightening Maggie's awareness of their vulnerability. The moon cast everything in silver and shadow, transforming familiar farm buildings into looming sentinels. Dylan's hand gripped hers tightly, his earlier excitement replaced by wary silence. The smokehouse stood apart from the main structures, a squat stone building that had once processed meats for winter storage. Its wooden door hung slightly ajar, hinges rusted from decades of prairie storms. Inside, the earthen floor was littered with abandoned equipment, broken tools, rusted barrel hoops, the accumulated detritus of a century of farming. According to the ledger, the entrance should be under that workbench, Maggie whispered, using her phone's flashlight to illuminate the space. Together, they shifted the massive wooden bench, its weight suggesting it hadn't been moved in years. Beneath it, almost invisible beneath a layer of packed earth, was the outline of a trapdoor. Dylan helped her brush away the dirt, revealing a metal ring set flush with the wooden surface. When she pulled, the door resisted briefly, then swung upward with surprising smoothness, revealing a set of concrete steps descending into darkness. Cool, Dylan breathed, momentarily forgetting their precarious situation. Maggie's flashlight beam revealed a chamber roughly 15 feet square, its walls lined with metal shelving. Unlike the chaos above, this space was immaculately organized, artifacts arranged by category and time period, each with a small typewritten card describing its provenance and significance. It's like a museum, Dylan whispered, while replacing his fear. It was more than that, Maggie realized as she moved deeper into the vault. It was a deliberate counter-narrative, a collection that told stories official histories often overlooked or simplified. Native American peace medals from treaties later broken by the government. Letters from homesteaders describing cooperation with indigenous peoples rather than conflict. Civil War diaries from both Union and Confederate soldiers questioning the causes they were fighting for. And coins, hundreds of them, from multiple eras and civilizations, each selected not just for its monetary value but for the historical moment it represented. Roman denarii that had witnessed the fall of empires. Colonial copper that had passed through the hands of revolutionaries. Silver dollars minted from ore that had transformed the American West. "Your uncle created something remarkable here," came a voice from the entrance. Maggie whirled to find Robert standing at the top of the steps, the sheriff's hulking silhouette visible behind him. Her heart pounded against her ribs, fight or flight instinct sending adrenaline coursing through her veins. "How did you find us?" she demanded, pushing Dylan behind her. Robert descended with deliberate steps, his tailored suit incongruous against the rough concrete walls. Nathan proved surprisingly resistant to questioning. Fortunately, his phone was less discreet. The sheriff tracked your location easily enough. The betrayal stung, though part of Maggie had expected it. In the digital age, disappearing wasn't as simple as driving without headlights down a back road. "This is private property," she countered. "My easement grants me access. Your easement is being reviewed for validity," Robert cut in smoothly. "In the meantime, the sheriff has concerns about potential theft of artifacts from historical sites, a federal offense, I believe." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably at the top of the stairs. "Ma'am, I'm just here to ensure everything stays peaceful while Mr. Coleman inspects his property." Robert reached the bottom step, his gaze sweeping across the meticulously organized shelves. For the first time, Maggie saw genuine emotion crack his polished facade, raw greed, thinly disguised as appreciation. "My God," he breathed. "It's worth millions." "It's not about the money," Maggie said, the words emerging with a conviction that surprised her. "Uncle Henry was preserving history, creating a collection that tells the whole story of this land, not just the convenient parts." Robert's laugh held no humor. "Always the idealist, just like Henry. But let's be practical, this vault is on my property, which makes its contents mine by law." "That's not how buried property works," Dylan piped up, his small voice steady despite the tension. "We researched it. Finders aren't keepers unless something is abandoned, and Great Uncle Henry never abandoned these. He was keeping them safe." Robert's gaze shifted to the boy, seeing him properly for the first time. Something flickered in his expression, recognition, perhaps, of the Coleman stubbornness manifesting in a new generation. "Clever boy," he said, voice softer. "But laws are interpreted by those with the resources to argue them effectively. Your mother knows this from her divorce, I imagine." The calculated cruelty of the reference made Maggie step forward, protective anger overriding caution. "This isn't just about ownership, Robert. It's about responsibility. Henry trusted me to ensure these artifacts weren't scattered or misused. He knew you'd only see dollar signs." "And what do you see?" Robert challenged. "A magical new beginning? Redemption through dirt and relics? The prodigal daughter returning to save the family legacy?" His smile turned cruel. "You left this place, Maggie. Spent 20 years pretending the farm didn't exist until you needed something from it." Each word struck with precision, targeting the guilt she'd carried since reading Henry's letter. She had abandoned this place, had built a life that deliberately excluded her rural roots. Now she was claiming a connection she'd previously rejected. "People change," she said quietly. "Sometimes it takes losing everything to recognize what matters." Touching. Truly. Robert's sarcasm couldn't quite mask the calculation behind his eyes. But irrelevant to the legal reality. "Now, step aside so I can properly inventory my newfound assets." Before Maggie could respond, the sheriff called down from above. "We've got a situation up here, Mr. Coleman." Robert's expression darkened. "What kind of situation?" "Multiple vehicles. News van from the NBC affiliate in North Platte. Representatives from the State Historical Society. Someone called them about a significant historical discovery." The blood drained from Robert's face. "What? Who would?" The answer came in the form of Nathan's voice, calling down from above. "Thought you might need reinforcements, Maggie." Turns out Henry had contingency plans in place if the vault was ever threatened. Robert spun toward the entrance, control visibly slipping. "This is private property. You have no right to bring media here." "Actually," came an authoritative female voice, "the State Historical Preservation Office has the right to investigate reports of significant historical discoveries on any property, particularly when those discoveries might qualify for emergency protection under state law." Maggie felt a surge of hope as a silver-haired woman in a practical pantsuit appeared at the top of the stairs, clipboard in hand and official identification badge visible on her lapel. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Whitman, Director of Preservation. And you must be Maggie Coleman." Her smile was professional but warm. "Your Uncle Henry contacted our office years ago about his collection. Left explicit instructions for us to be notified if certain conditions were met." Robert's composure cracked entirely. "This is absurd. You can't just invade private property based on some paranoid old man's conspiracy theories." Dr. Whitman's expression cooled considerably. "Mr. Coleman, I presume? I should inform you that our office has been monitoring your property for potential historical significance for some time. The documentation your uncle provided was extensive." As Robert sputtered indignantly, Nathan appeared beside Dr. Whitman, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Henry always said the best defense is a good offense. And multiple layers of backup plans." In that moment, standing amid her uncle's carefully preserved treasures, with Dylan's hand clasped firmly in hers and unexpected allies gathering above, Maggie felt something shift inside her, a recognition that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not because of blood or inheritance or even the valuable artifacts surrounding her, but because for the first time in years, she was fighting for something larger than herself. The battle for Henry Coleman's legacy was just beginning, but its most important victory had already been won. What had started as a rusty tractor and a brass key had become something far more valuable, a purpose worth staying for, a history worth protecting, and a future suddenly rich with possibility. The State Historical Society's arrival transformed the Coleman farm overnight. What had been a clandestine excavation became an official archaeological assessment, with teams of experts cataloging and documenting each item from Henry's vault. White canopies sprouted like mushrooms across the property, sheltering workstations where artifacts were carefully examined, photographed, and registered. For 3 days, Maggie and Dylan watched from the sidelines as professionals handled the treasures they had only begun to discover. Dr. Whitman established a temporary headquarters in the farmhouse's front room, where Robert had been conspicuously absent since his confrontation in the vault. "Your uncle's collection is extraordinary," Dr. Whitman told Maggie on the 4th morning, spreading photographs across a makeshift desk. "Not just for its monetary value, but for its historical cohesion. These aren't random valuable items, they tell a deliberate story about this region that challenges many conventional narratives." Maggie studied the images, Native American peace medals displayed alongside military orders that contradicted their promises, homesteader diaries juxtaposed with land-grant documents revealing the government's duplicity. He was creating a counterhistory. Precisely. Dr. Whitman's eyes lit with professional excitement. Henry wasn't just hoarding collectibles, he was preserving evidence. The question is, what did he intend to do with it? The answer came that afternoon when Nathan arrived with a safe deposit box key he'd retrieved from the local bank. Henry left instructions that this should be opened 7 days after the vault was discovered. Inside the box was a leather portfolio containing legal documents and a letter addressed to Maggie in her uncle's familiar handwriting. The room fell silent as she unfolded the pages. "Dear Maggie," she read aloud, voice steady despite the emotion tightening her throat. "If you're reading this, then you've found the vault and begun to understand what I've spent my life collecting. What may not yet be clear is why." Henry's letter explained how his time in Vietnam had awakened him to how history was written by victors, how inconvenient truths were buried beneath simplified narratives. Upon returning to Nebraska, he'd recognized similar patterns in how regional history was presented, sanitized, straightforward, devoid of the complexity and contradiction that defined actual human experience. "The land remembers what men forget," he wrote. "Or choose to ignore. I began collecting not for value, but for truth, artifacts and documents that told the complete story of this place we call home, including the painful chapters most prefer to overlook. His vision, laid out in detailed instructions, was for the creation of a living museum and research center on the Coleman property. The historical artifacts would anchor an educational institution dedicated to exploring the region's complex past through multiple perspectives: Native American, settler, immigrant, and modern. The legal documents included a trust established decades earlier, funded by strategic investments that had grown to over $4 million, designated specifically for this purpose. The land was never meant to be subdivided or developed, the letter continued. It was meant to teach. To remember. To honor both what we got right and what we got wrong. Robert will fight this. His vision extends only to profit margins and status symbols. That's why I needed someone with Coleman blood who understood both worlds, someone who had left but could find their way back. Someone who could see value beyond a balance sheet. Dr. Whitman leaned forward as Maggie finished reading. These trust documents are legally binding. The money exists, designated specifically for establishing the Coleman Historical Center as a non-profit educational institution. If you choose to accept the directorship, as Henry designated, this project could begin immediately. The implications stunned Maggie into silence. Her uncle hadn't just left her a tractor with hidden treasures, he'd created a foundation for an entirely new chapter of her life, a purpose that would root her permanently to the land she'd once been so eager to escape. What about Robert? She finally asked. The land is still legally his. Nathan, who had been silently observing from the doorway, stepped forward. Not exactly. The final pages explain Henry's most careful maneuver. The document Nathan indicated was a land transfer dated 15 years earlier, conveying ownership of the central 40 acres, including the farmhouse, barn, and smokehouse, to a conservation trust. The transfer had been conditional upon Robert's decision about the property after Henry's death. If Robert had chosen to maintain the farm as a working agricultural operation, the transfer would have been voided, Dr. Whitman explained. But the moment he filed permits for commercial development last month, it automatically triggered this clause. The core of the property legally belongs to the trust now, not to Robert. The elegant simplicity of Henry's long game left Maggie breathless. He had anticipated every move, prepared for every contingency, all while appearing to be nothing more than an eccentric old farmer tinkering with antiques. "Does Robert know?" she asked. "He does now," came a voice from the doorway. Robert stood there, his usual polished appearance noticeably diminished. His suit was rumpled, his face haggard from sleepless nights and legal consultations. Behind him loomed his attorney, a nervous-looking man clutching an overstuffed briefcase. "3 days of legal research confirms what I didn't want to believe," Robert said, the fight gone from his voice. "Henry outmaneuvered me from beyond the grave. The development deal is dead. No investor will touch it with the Historical Society's involvement and the central acreage legally encumbered." Rather than triumph, Maggie felt an unexpected wave of compassion. For all their differences, Robert was family, the last connection to her father besides herself and Dylan. "It doesn't have to be a total loss for you," she said. "The museum will need administrative support, financial oversight. Your business experience could be valuable." Robert's laugh held more weariness than bitterness. "Always the peacemaker, Maggie. Just like your father." He stepped further into the room, examining the photographs spread across the desk. "Henry never forgave my father for leaving the farm, you know. Carried that grudge for 50 years. I always thought he left me the land as final reconciliation, his way of saying the past was forgiven." "Maybe this is the real reconciliation," Maggie suggested. "Not giving you the land to develop, but inviting you to help preserve what matters about it." Something shifted in Robert's expression, not quite acceptance, but the first crack in a lifetime of defensive ambition. "I'll have my attorney review the trust documents. If there's a role that makes sense for my skill set, I'll consider it." It wasn't surrender, but it was acknowledgement, a businessman's pragmatic recognition that adaptation offered better prospects than continued opposition. After Robert departed, Dr. Whitman gathered the documents with brisk efficiency. We'll need to file these with the county immediately. Once that's done, we can begin formal establishment of the Coleman Historical Center. She paused, studying Maggie's face. That is, if you're accepting the directorship. The question crystallized the choice Maggie had been circling since discovering the tractor's secrets. Accepting meant staying, committing to a life far removed from her previous corporate existence. It meant raising Dylan in this rural community, away from the urban advantages she'd always considered essential. It meant becoming the caretaker of a legacy she'd only just begun to understand. I need time, she said finally, to think about what this means for us. That evening, as sunset painted the prairie in shades of amber and gold, Maggie sat on Nathan's porch swing, watching Dylan help with evening chores. The boy moved with growing confidence around the farm equipment, his city hesitation replaced by the beginnings of rural competence. He's a natural, Nathan observed, settling beside her with 2 mugs of coffee. Has the Coleman eye for detail. He's thriving here, Maggie admitted. I haven't seen him this engaged with the real world since before the divorce. In Chicago, he was retreating deeper into video games every day, shutting down emotionally. Land has a way of drawing people out of themselves. Nathan's voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who had experienced this truth personally. Hard to stay wrapped up in your own problems when there's work that needs doing, creatures that depend on you. Maggie sipped her coffee, allowing the peaceful evening to settle around them. Henry seemed so certain I'd stay. That I'd want this life, this responsibility. And do you? The question hung between them, simple yet profound. A month ago, I would have said absolutely not, she answered honestly. My whole identity was tied to city life, professional accomplishment, raising Dylan with all the advantages I thought mattered. Now. She gestured toward the horizon, where the last light gilded endless fields. Now I'm not so sure what matters most. Nathan nodded, understanding in his silence. What was Henry to you, really? She asked suddenly. You've helped me at every turn, risked legal trouble, confronted Robert. That goes beyond being a good neighbor. Something vulnerable flickered across Nathan's weathered features. Henry saved my life, he said finally. Not dramatically, there was no burning building or drowning accident. But when I came back from the Gulf War, I was lost. Couldn't readjust, couldn't reconnect with civilian life. Was drinking too much, picking fights, spiraling towards something dark. He set his mug down carefully, as if organizing his thoughts. Henry offered me work when no one else would take a chance on a volatile vet with anger issues. Taught me to focus on building things that last, on caring for living things, on connecting with the land. Said working soil was the best therapy for a troubled mind because it required presence, complete attention to what's right in front of you. The revelation illuminated so much, Nathan's devotion to Henry's vision, his immediate understanding of the vault's significance, his patient guidance as Maggie discovered her uncle's legacy. He never mentioned your father, Nathan continued. Never spoke badly of those who left. But he believed deeply that some people belong to particular places, that there's a reciprocal relationship between certain bloodlines and the land they've worked. He was convinced you had that connection, even if you didn't know it yet. And do you believe that? Maggie asked, suddenly needing to know. Nathan's eyes met hers, direct and honest. I believe we choose our belonging. Your uncle thought it was predetermined, that Coleman blood would call you back eventually. I think it's more complicated than that. We choose what we value, where we invest ourselves. Those choices matter more than DNA. His perspective offered a freedom Henry's deterministic view hadn't, the possibility that staying would be a choice rather than an obligation, a deliberate embracing rather than a surrender to inevitability. The following morning brought news that shifted their focus from philosophical questions to practical concerns. The county assessor arrived with preliminary property maps showing exactly which 40 acres now belonged to the Conservation Trust, and revealing a significant complication. The smokehouse and vault are actually located just outside the protected zone, Dr. Whitman explained, tracing boundaries on the yellowed survey. They fall within Robert's remaining property by approximately 20 yards. The oversight threatened the entire museum concept. Without legal access to the vault and its contents, the historical center would lose its foundational collection. Could we move the artifacts? Maggie suggested. Dr. Whitman shook her head. Many items are too fragile for relocation, and removing them from their original context would diminish their historical significance. Besides, the vault itself is an important structure, an example of Cold War-era preservation techniques. So Robert still holds the cards, Maggie concluded, frustration edging her voice. Not necessarily, came Dillon's unexpected contribution. He'd been silently examining the property maps, his analytical mind engaging with the problem in ways the adults had overlooked. Look at the dates on these surveys. The one Henry used for his trust is from 1978, but there's a newer one from 1992 that shows the creek bed shifted after the big flood. Dr. Whitman blinked, clearly surprised by the boy's insight. Property boundaries can indeed change with natural watercourse shifts. If the creek was used as a boundary marker. A flurry of research confirmed Dillon's observation. The 1992 survey showed the creek had migrated approximately 30 yards eastward during severe flooding, which would place the smokehouse and vault within the trust's protected zone under riparian boundary law, a legal principle specifically noted in Henry's trust documentation. Your uncle anticipated even this, Dr. Whitman said, admiration evident in her voice. He knew the property lines would be disputed and built in multiple layers of protection. The discovery shifted the legal landscape dramatically. Rather than fighting for access to the vault, the Historical Society could now assert ownership based on recognized boundary adjustment principles. Robert would undoubtedly challenge this interpretation, but his position had weakened considerably. That afternoon, as news of the boundary discovery spread, Nathan found Maggie sitting alone by the creek that had become so central to their legal position. The water flowed clear over smooth stones, giving no indication of its power to reshape boundaries and destinies. Dillon's observation may have saved the whole project, he said, settling beside her on the grassy bank. Kid has a sharp eye. Just like his mother, came a new voice. Richard Coleman, Maggie's ex-husband, stood a few yards away, looking distinctly uncomfortable in designer jeans and a button-down shirt that seemed determined to remain unwrinkled despite the rural setting. Beside him, Dillon shifted anxiously, clearly having led his father to this spot. Richard. Maggie stood, surprise rendering her momentarily speechless. What are you doing here? Our son called me. Richard's gaze moved from Maggie to Nathan and back again, assessing the situation with the same analytical precision that had made him a successful corporate attorney. Said he'd made an important discovery about something called riparian boundaries, and that I should see what you two have been up to. The you two carried implications that made Maggie acutely aware of how comfortable she'd become in Nathan's presence over the past weeks. Richard's arrival collapsed the distance between her previous life and current reality, worlds she'd been holding carefully separate. Nathan rose, extending his hand with deliberate courtesy. Nathan Whitaker. Neighbor. Richard's handshake was brief but not dismissive. Richard Coleman. Ex-husband, apparently turned legal consultant. Dillon's been filling me in on this situation. An awkward silence followed, broken by Dillon's determined cheerfulness. Dad knows all about property law from his corporate work. I thought he could help with Uncle Robert. The boy's strategic thinking impressed Maggie even as it complicated her emotional landscape. Of course Dillon would want both his parents involved in something this significant, would want to unite his fractured family around this new center of gravity. Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more comfortable, Richard suggested, glancing dubiously at the creek bank. The farmhouse kitchen became an impromptu conference room, with Richard examining Henry's trust documents with professional attention while Dr. Whitman explained the historical significance of the collection. To Maggie's surprise, her ex-husband asked insightful questions, showing genuine interest rather than the dismissive efficiency she'd expected. This riparian boundary adjustment creates a strong position, he concluded after nearly an hour of review. But Robert will fight it, he's always been tenacious when his financial interests are threatened. You need someone who understands both property law and family dynamics. Someone like you, Maggie said, recognizing the direction of his thinking. Richard nodded, a familiar gleam of professional challenge in his eyes. I specialize in complex corporate property disputes. This situation has fascinating legal dimensions, historical preservation rights, conditional land transfers, boundary adjustments. And he glanced at Dylan, who watched the adults with hopeful attention. It matters to our son. The offer hung in the air, complicated by their personal history but compelling in its practicality. Richard's legal expertise would be invaluable against Robert's inevitable challenges. What would your involvement look like? Maggie asked carefully. Initial consultation, strategy development, perhaps some negotiation with Robert's attorneys. I wouldn't need to relocate, most of it could be handled remotely, with occasional visits. His gaze moved around the kitchen, taking in the worn linoleum and dated appliances. Though I'd need better accommodations than this farmhouse appears to offer. Nathan, who had remained silent throughout the legal discussion, spoke up. Town has a decent hotel. Nothing fancy, but clean. The men exchanged a look of mutual assessment, neither hostile nor particularly warm, each taking the measure of the other's place in Maggie's evolving world. That evening, after Richard had checked into the Ridgeline Inn and promised to return in the morning, Maggie found herself once again on Nathan's porch, watching the fireflies emerge as darkness settled across the fields. Richard seems competent, Nathan observed, his tone deliberately neutral. He's brilliant at his job, Maggie acknowledged. Always has been. And as a father? The question might have seemed presumptuous coming from anyone else, but weeks of shared challenges had earned Nathan the right to directness. Devoted but distant, she answered honestly. Provided everything Dylan could need materially, but struggled with emotional connection. The divorce was as much about Richard's relationship with his work as it was about our relationship with each other. Nathan absorbed this, his silence thoughtful rather than judgmental. And now he's here, offering professional help. Convenient timing. You think he has ulterior motives? I think a man doesn't fly halfway across the country just for an interesting legal problem, even if his son asks. Nathan's gaze remained on the distant horizon. He's assessing what you found here, not just the artifacts or legal situation, but the life you're building without him. The observation carried a perception Maggie couldn't deny. Richard's arrival had shifted something, introduced a variable into an equation she was just beginning to understand. His presence reminded her of the life she'd left behind, the world of professional accomplishment and urban convenience she'd once valued above all else. I haven't decided to stay permanently, she reminded both Nathan and herself. Haven't you? His question carried no pressure, only gentle inquiry. You're already talking about educational programming, community involvement, how to structure the historical center's research department. Those aren't the plans of someone with one foot out the door. Before she could respond, Dylan appeared from the barn where he'd been helping with evening chores. His face glowed with the particular satisfaction that comes from meaningful physical work. Mr. Nathan, the new calf is trying to stand up, he called, excitement overriding his indoor voice. Come quick. They followed him to the barn, where a wobbly-legged Hereford calf was indeed attempting its first vertical moments, long legs splaying comically on the straw-covered floor. Its mother stood nearby, watchful but allowing the necessary struggle. Dylan positioned himself beside the calf, not helping but providing encouraging presence. You can do it, he whispered. It's hard at first, but you're strong. The simple encouragement, delivered with such earnest faith, brought unexpected tears to Maggie's eyes. This was who her son became in this place, not the withdrawn boy hunched over electronic devices, but an engaged, compassionate participant in the fundamental cycles of life. The calf finally achieved balance, standing tremulously for several triumphant seconds before toppling back into the straw. Dylan's laughter, genuine, unburdened joy, echoed in the barn's wooden heights. In that moment, surrounded by the ancient rhythms of birth and growth, Maggie recognized the truth Nathan had identified. Her decision had indeed been made, not in grand epiphany but in accumulating moments of belonging, in Dylan's blossoming, in her growing connection to Henry's vision, in the sense of purpose she'd found amid these fields and artifacts. The following week unfolded with increasing clarity and momentum. Richard's legal expertise proved invaluable as they negotiated with Robert, eventually reaching a settlement that acknowledged the adjusted boundaries while granting Robert a position on the museum's advisory board and naming rights for the research library. He needs to save face, Richard explained as they finalized the agreement. The Coleman pride runs deep on both sides of the family. Maggie recognized the truth in this assessment, including its application to Richard himself. His involvement had evolved from initial consultation to active participation, his corporate efficiency streamlining processes that might otherwise have taken months. "Will you be returning to Chicago soon?" she asked as they left the county clerk's office, documents officially filed and boundaries legally established. Richard considered the question with unusual thoughtfulness. "Eventually. The firm expects me back next week. But I've been thinking about regional offices, satellite locations. Nebraska has an emerging agricultural technology sector that could benefit from specialized legal representation." The implication was clear: he was creating options, building bridges between his world and the one Dylan was embracing. Not reconciliation, but connection; not returning, but extending. "Dylan would like having you visit more often," Maggie offered, a Peace branch of her own. As summer transitioned to early fall, the Coleman Historical Center began taking tangible form. The farmhouse underwent careful restoration, its structure preserved while interior spaces were adapted for educational use. The vault's contents, now professionally cataloged, formed the core of an exhibition that was already attracting attention from regional universities and national museums. Dr. Whitman secured Maggie's position as executive director, with Nathan heading agricultural operations that would maintain working demonstrations of historical farming practices. Dylan enrolled in the local school, where his unique combination of urban background and newfound rural knowledge made him an unexpected bridge between town kids and farm children. On a golden September afternoon, as the first official tour group explored the property, Maggie found herself standing beside the John Deere tractor that had started everything. Its restoration complete, it gleamed in the autumn sunlight, no longer a rusted relic but a functional piece of living history. Nathan joined her, his quiet presence familiar and comforting. "Henry would be pleased," he said simply. "Everything unfolding just as he hoped." "Not exactly as he planned," Maggie corrected gently. "He thought I'd come back because of some mystical Coleman connection to the land. But that's not why I'm staying." "No?" She turned to face him fully, finding the words for a truth that had been gradually crystallizing over these transformative months. "I'm staying because this is where I found purpose again, not in the past or in some biological determinism, but in creating something meaningful for the future. In giving Dylan roots without clipping his wings. In building connection rather than chasing success." Her hand found his, the contact natural and unhurried. "And because some connections are worth exploring without knowing exactly where they'll lead." Nathan's fingers tightened around hers, his weathered face softening with promise and possibility. Around them, the farm continued its ancient rhythms, fields ripening toward harvest, livestock growing toward winter weight, buildings weathering toward patina rather than decay. The tractor that had seemed worthless now anchored tours about agricultural evolution. The vault that had been hidden now educated visitors about complex regional histories. The land that had been neglected now flourished under renewed purpose. As Dylan led a group of schoolchildren toward the barn, his confident voice explaining traditional animal husbandry with the authority of someone coming into his own, Maggie recognized the final truth of her uncle's legacy. What Henry had preserved wasn't just artifacts or land or even family connection, it was the possibility of renewal, the opportunity to find meaning in stewardship rather than ownership, in continuity rather than conquest. The rusty tractor had indeed revealed treasures, not just the monetary value of buried coins or the historical significance of preserved documents, but the incalculable worth of belonging somewhere, of continuing something worthwhile, of building a life measured not in financial statements but in generations touched and perspectives changed. As the autumn light gilded everything in temporary perfection, Maggie allowed herself to fully inhabit this moment of arrival, not at a destination, but at a beginning rich with hard-won wisdom and unhurried grace. The land had called her home, just as Henry believed it would. But she had answered not out of obligation to the past, but out of commitment to the future, a future she was now building, one careful choice at a time, in the fertile soil of possibility her uncle had preserved for her to find. The 5-year anniversary of the Coleman Historical Center's opening drew visitors from across 3 states. What had begun as a local curiosity had evolved into a respected regional institution, its innovative approach to historical narrative earning recognition from the Smithsonian and a feature in National Geographic's cultural preservation issue. Maggie stood on the farmhouse porch, watching the autumn sun transform the morning mist into ribbons of gold that clung to the meadow grass. At 45, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her place in the world, not where she had expected, but where she belonged nonetheless. "Nervous about the ceremony?" Nathan asked, joining her with 2 steaming mugs. In the years since they'd married, this dawn ritual had become sacred, coffee shared in companionable silence as they watched the land awaken. "Not nervous," she replied, accepting the offered cup. "Just reflective. 5 years ago, I thought I was at the end of something. Turns out I was just at the beginning." The property had transformed in those years, not through dramatic reconstruction but thoughtful restoration. The farmhouse now served as the center's administrative headquarters and contained exhibits on homesteader life. The barn housed agricultural demonstrations where visitors could experience historical farming techniques firsthand. The smokehouse in its underground vault had become the most popular attraction, a time capsule that told complex, often contradictory stories about the region's development. Most significantly, the surrounding fields remained working farmland, producing heritage crops through methods that honored both tradition and sustainability. What visitors saw wasn't a museum frozen in time, but a living demonstration of how past and present could coexist in productive harmony. Dylan emerged from the barn, now 15 and nearly as tall as Nathan. The gangly awkwardness of early adolescence was giving way to a young man's purposeful stride. He developed his own relationship with the land, not the obligation Henry had envisioned, but a chosen connection rooted in curiosity and respect. "Dad's here," he called, gesturing toward the gravel drive where Richard's Audi was raising a modest dust cloud. Since the divorce, Richard had carved out a new role in their lives, not husband or full-time father, but a consistent, supportive presence who had found his own connection to the Coleman legacy. His legal expertise had proven invaluable in navigating the complexities of establishing the historical center, and his quarterly visits had become an anticipated rhythm in their lives. More surprisingly, Richard and Robert had developed an unlikely alliance. The cousins who had once represented opposite life choices, rural versus urban, tradition versus progress, had found common ground in their shared legal and business acumen. Together, they had structured the center's endowment and governance to ensure its long-term viability, creating something neither could have built alone. The anniversary celebration would officially begin at noon, but the morning brought a more private ritual. Each year on this day, those most central to the center's creation gathered at the original tractor, now permanently displayed in a purpose-built pavilion, to honor Henry's vision and add new artifacts to a modern time capsule that would someday tell their story to future generations. Dr. Whitman arrived first, her silver hair now completely white but her energy undiminished. She carried a leather portfolio containing the year's acquisitions, documents, photographs, and small artifacts that had been donated to expand the collection Henry had begun. "The governor sends regrets," she announced, joining them at the pavilion. "Budget negotiations in Lincoln. But he's signed the proclamation officially recognizing the center as a state historical treasure." Robert arrived next, driving the restored 1957 pickup truck that had become his unlikely passion. The corporate polish remained, but 5 years of involvement with the center had softened his edges. He'd discovered an unexpected aptitude for translating historical narratives into engaging exhibitions, his business sensibility complementing the academic's more scholarly approach. "Traffic's backed up halfway to town," he reported, accepting the coffee Maggie offered. "Looks like attendance will exceed projections again." What had begun as reluctant participation had evolved into genuine investment. Robert had never apologized for his initial opposition. The Coleman pride wouldn't permit such direct acknowledgement of error, but his actions had demonstrated a shifting perspective. the man who had once viewed the land purely as a development opportunity now spoke passionately about preserving its cultural significance. As they gathered around the tractor that had started everything, Dylan produced this year's addition to the Time Capsule, a documentary he'd created interviewing elderly residents about farming practices before mechanization. The project had won regional recognition in a youth historical preservation competition, its unvarnished oral histories capturing perspectives often absent from official records. Henry would have approved, Nathan said as they watched the boy carefully place the digital storage device in its protective container. Especially coming from the next generation. The observation carried particular weight this year. 3 months earlier, they had received a letter from a woman in Arizona claiming to be Henry Coleman's daughter, the product of a relationship during his Vietnam service that he had never acknowledged. DNA testing had confirmed her claim, adding a complicated new dimension to their understanding of the man whose vision had reshaped their lives. Elaine Coleman Parker would be arriving later that day for her first visit to the farm, bringing her own children and grandchildren, branches of the Coleman family tree none of them had known existed. The discovery had initially unsettled Maggie, forcing her to reconcile the uncle she thought she knew with this profound omission. But as the shock faded, she recognized the gift hidden within the revelation: new connections, expanded perspective, another layer to the already complex narrative they were preserving. The morning's private ceremony concluded with each person adding something personal to the time capsule. Richard contributed a legal brief that had established precedent for historical preservation easements. Robert included architectural plans for the center's next expansion. Dr. Whitman added a scholarly article on Henry's collection methodology. Nathan placed a hand-carved model of the farmhouse, created from wood harvested on the property. When Maggie's turn came, she hesitated before adding her contribution, a small brass key, identical to the one that had unlocked the tractor's hidden compartment 5 years earlier. "Where did you find another one?" Dylan asked, curiosity overriding teenage reserve. "I didn't," she replied. "This is the original. It opened the door to everything that followed, but we don't need it anymore. The secrets are out in the open now, being shared rather than hidden. It belongs with the story." The simple object carried the weight of transformation, of resources once buried now nurturing new growth, of history once concealed now illuminating understanding. What Henry had protected through secrecy, they now preserved through openness and education. As the others moved toward the main building to prepare for the public ceremony, Maggie lingered beside the tractor. Its restoration had been one of Nathan's first projects, a labor of love that had returned the machine to working condition while preserving the patina that told its story. "Did we get it right, Henry?" she asked softly, running her fingers along the smooth metal that had once been covered in rust. "Is this what you imagined?" No answer came from the silent machine, but she felt a certainty that had been building over these 5 years. Henry's plan had succeeded beyond his expectation not because she had followed it exactly, but because she had made it her own, had taken his foundation and built something both honoring tradition and embracing change. The public celebration unfolded throughout the afternoon, drawing visitors from across the region. Traditional music filled the air as demonstrations of historical crafts and agricultural techniques dotted the grounds. Children laughed as they churned butter and dipped candles, connecting with processes their ancestors had considered daily necessities. Maggie moved through the crowds, greeting regular visitors and welcoming newcomers, occasionally catching glimpses of her extended family engaged in various aspects of the celebration. Dylan guiding a group of teenagers through the vault exhibits. Richard discussing preservation law with university students. Robert explaining the economics of historical farming to interested investors. Nathan demonstrating draft horse techniques in the eastern field. And, most remarkably, Elaine Coleman Parker, Henry's previously unknown daughter, absorbing her father's legacy with quiet intensity, her grandchildren exploring their unexpected heritage with the uninhibited enthusiasm of youth. As afternoon mellowed toward evening, the formal program began on a stage erected near the original barn. Dr. Whitman spoke about the center's academic contributions, followed by the county commissioner highlighting its economic impact on the region. Robert detailed plans for upcoming exhibitions, his businessman's precision softened by genuine passion for the subject. When Maggie's turn came to address the gathered community, she set aside her prepared remarks, speaking instead from the heart about transformation, of land, of purpose, of understanding. 5 years ago, I stood on this property believing I'd inherited nothing of value, she told the attentive crowd. A broken-down tractor, a dilapidated farmhouse, a family history I'd spent decades trying to escape. What I couldn't see then was that value isn't always obvious, that what matters most often lies beneath the surface, waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it. She gestured toward the surrounding fields, now golden with autumn. This land has taught me that history isn't a single story but a tapestry of perspectives, some prominent, others hidden, all essential to understanding the whole. Henry Coleman understood this truth. He spent decades preserving artifacts and documents that complicated convenient narratives, that forced us to confront contradictions and uncomfortable realities in our regional history. The audience listened with respectful attention, many nodding in recognition of how the center had challenged their own understanding of familiar stories. But history isn't just about looking backward, Maggie continued. It's about recognizing patterns, understanding consequences, making better choices for the future. That's why this isn't just a museum, it's a working farm, a research institution, an educational center. It's history breathing, teaching, evolving. As she concluded her remarks, the setting sun bathed everything in amber light, creating the illusion that the buildings and people were gilded in the same warm glow. The effect seemed fitting, not false perfection, but momentary transformation that acknowledged both flaws and beauty. Later, after the crowds had dispersed and the cleanup crews had departed, the extended family gathered on the farmhouse porch. The improbable collection of people represented branches of the Coleman tree that had grown in wildly different directions, the rural traditionalists, the urban professionals, the unexpected offspring of a secret kept for decades. Richard and Robert discussed potential funding sources for the center's educational programs, their corporate mindsets finding common purpose in sustainability planning. Dylan showed Elaine's grandchildren his latest woodworking project, the teenagers bonding over shared heritage despite having met just hours earlier. Nathan and Elaine compared memories of Henry, piecing together different aspects of a man who had presented distinct facets to different people in his life. Watching them, Maggie recognized that this, even more than the preserved artifacts or restored buildings, was Henry's true legacy. Not perfect reconciliation or artificial harmony, but genuine connection across differences that had once seemed insurmountable. The family remained complicated, marked by old wounds and new uncertainties, but it was alive and evolving rather than fractured and frozen. As darkness settled across the farm, stars emerging in the vast Nebraska sky, Maggie felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with tasks finished and everything to do with circles joined. The tractor that had seemed worthless had revealed treasures beyond monetary value, had unlocked not just hidden artifacts but new possibilities, connections, and understandings. "Penny for your thoughts," Nathan said, joining her at the porch railing while the others continued their conversations behind them. "I was thinking about rust," she replied, leaning comfortably against his shoulder. "How we see it as decay, as something valuable being destroyed. But it's also protective in its way, a surface reaction that sometimes preserves what's underneath." Nathan nodded, understanding the metaphor without need for explanation. "Like emotional armor. Looks like damage from the outside, but it's actually preserving something essential until the right time." "Exactly." She turned to face the assembled family, their voices and laughter carrying into the night. "Henry's secrecy, Robert's ambition, my father's departure, your isolation after the war, all forms of rust. Protective responses to difficult circumstances. But underneath, something valuable remained intact until conditions were right for it to emerge." The observations settled between them, neither sentimental nor simplistic but recognizing both the damage and preservation that time works upon people and places. The farm had endured decades of apparent neglect while secretly nurturing an extraordinary collection. The family had weathered generations of division while maintaining connections that could eventually be rediscovered and renewed. As the evening deepened, younger members of the family drifted toward a bonfire that Dylan and his cousins had built in the nearby field. The older generation remained on the porch, conversation flowing easily between people who had once been strangers or adversaries. "I've been thinking about expanding the agricultural program," Nathan said, including everyone in the discussion. "Using the north section to demonstrate drought-resistant techniques the original homesteaders developed. Techniques we might need again with climate patterns shifting. The museum could incorporate oral histories about adaptation strategies," Robert suggested. "Create a narrative connection between historical resilience and contemporary challenges." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "And there's potential funding through the new Climate Adaptation Education Initiative at the state level. I've been reviewing the grant criteria." The conversation continued, practical and forward-looking while remaining rooted in the traditions they'd all come to value. Plans took shape, not monuments to the past but living demonstrations of how historical knowledge could inform future choices. When Elaine finally spoke, her perspective brought new dimension to their planning. "Henry never talked about his family when I knew him in Vietnam," she said, her voice holding decades of complicated emotion. "But he talked constantly about this land, not as property but as partnership. He believed we don't really own places, we collaborate with them. Temporarily." The insight illuminated another facet of Henry's character, the young soldier carrying the wisdom of his prairie upbringing into a war zone half a world away, finding in that knowledge the resilience to survive and eventually create a daughter he would never acknowledge. As midnight approached, Maggie excused herself and walked alone to the small rise where Henry's grave lay beneath an ancient oak. The polished granite headstone was simple, bearing only his name, dates, and the phrase he'd written in his final letter, "The land remembers what men forget." "It worked, Uncle Henry," she said softly to the quiet night. "Not exactly how you planned, but better in some ways. The collection is being shared, not just preserved. The family is healing, not just surviving. The land is teaching, not just producing." No dramatic sign acknowledged her words, no sudden breeze or symbolic animal appearance. Just the steady presence of earth beneath her feet and the distant laughter of children who carried Coleman blood mixed with other lineages, other stories, other possibilities. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed for harvest. Though most anniversary visitors had departed, a new group was arriving, a class of graduate students from the State University's Historical Preservation Program, coming for a week-long immersion in the center's methodologies. Maggie greeted them in the farmhouse kitchen, where Dylan was demonstrating historical breakfast preparation techniques to Elaine's grandchildren. The easy camaraderie between these previously unknown cousins suggested connections that would outlast the anniversary celebration. "Welcome to the Coleman Historical Center," she told the students, recognizing in their eager expressions the same curiosity that had driven Henry's collecting. "Before we begin the formal tour, I'd like to tell you a story about a rusty tractor and what it taught me about value, perspective, and the stories buried just beneath the surface we think we know." The students settled around the large kitchen table, notebooks open and recorders running, ready to absorb not just academic knowledge but lived experience. As Maggie began the now familiar tale, she felt the story ripple outward, from Henry to her, from her to these students, from them to communities yet unknown. Outside, the farm continued its ancient rhythms, soil preparing for winter rest, trees shedding leaves to nurture next year's growth, buildings weathering toward patina rather than decay. The land that had seemed worthless now nurtured understanding alongside crops. The history that had been buried now illuminated paths forward. And in the barn, preserved in its pavilion of honor, the old John Deere tractor stood as testimony to what remains when rust is gently removed, not pristine newness, but enduring purpose, ready for whoever might next recognize its value. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.